Our eating got more and more haphazard. My grandmother never prepared anything now, and it never occurred to me to try to cook, any more than I tried to clean up the house. My aunt did her best to sort us out from time to time. One summer day I went to see my cousins and said, "Granny's too tired to get up today." My aunt's tired, pretty face looked up from the wash tub and she started drying her hands at once. "I'll just go and see," she said, and put on her shawl. Later on that day she told me. "What will I do then?" I said in a very loud, angry voice that hid how scared I was. Then I answered myself, "I know. I'll come and live with you in Coleman." My aunt slowly shook her head and lifted me onto her lap, something she did not often have time to do. "Wise child, you know we love you," she said, "but there's no room. And there's not enough food for the children I've got already. And in any case, Uncle Gregor—" Aunt Morag was mortally afraid of Uncle Gregor. I knew that what she said was true. I had often seen the children in bed, 5 of them crammed together, which I would have hated, and in the same room as my uncle and aunt. I suddenly remembered how, when my grandmother in her good days had baked a cake or made a stew, they had devoured it desperately, and how once, when I had taken the last oatcake in my thoughtless way, Bride's eyes had filled with tears. I was a proud child who loved my own bed, my clean smock, my good leather shoes that Finbar had bought me, and I liked to eat. "So what will happen to me?" I began to wail, but I knew the answer before she began to tell me. In our village, which prided itself on taking care of those who needed it, we had an institution called the auction. When a child's parents died, or sometimes if a woman was left alone in the world, the village would gather together after Mass, standing in a circle on a piece of grass in front of the small stone church. The priest would preside, and together they would all work out who needed the service of the homeless one, or, more often, who could be persuaded to put up with him or her. "But what about Finbar?" I said desperately, trying to think of a way out. "It's like him to be away when he's needed," my aunt said. "The Lord knows when he'll be back. Where could you live, chick, in the meantime? Who will look after you?" I longed to say, "I will look after myself." But I knew that I could not do it. When my hair was still long, I could not wash it or plait it myself. I could not make a soup or a stew, or bake a cake or a loaf. Though hunger had taught me how to make porridge, I wept again for my helplessness, for the public humiliation of the auction. "It is not so bad," my aunt comforted me. "There are good women in the village, and if they are not good to you, they will have me to reckon with." It was not that I minded so much. It was not that I minded so much, though. It was more that I had thought myself special, a child to be prized, and now all of a sudden I was a thing like a pot or a pan, to be bargained over. So I sat and wept throughout Mass, and afterward the priest led me out to the waiting ring of villagers outside. He was an Irishman, with the crinkly red hair and the flashing skin that was different from the blonde hair, the blue eyes, and the clear patter of most of our people. His hand rested heavily on my shoulder. I wriggled to get out from underneath it, but he tightened the hold. "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who bade us to care for the homeless and the fatherless, I am asking you this morning to find a home for this little sister of ours, reminding you that charity is the essence of our faith, and that you will be piling up a reward for yourselves in heaven." Despite this incentive, there was a long silence. I hung my head. Nobody wanted me, it seemed. Then Bridget from the beyond spoke. "We could do with a girl's pair of hands about the place, especially just now with the harvest coming in. But she's really too small and she's never worked. We always said she was a spoiled one." Greta, the scarred, spoke next. "I could train her to work," she said. "There's no lazy girls in my house." I had seen her children, anxious and worn, little workhorses, before they were 8 years old. They did not get to school much, and when they did, they had swollen eyes from weeping and the marks of a beating on them. I could feel my aunt tense beside me. "What other offers?" said the priest. "A apparently indifferent to who should take me in. There was another long silence, and I began pressing my nails tightly into my palms to resist the fate of being taken by Greta. I will be glad to care for her, if she would like that, Juniper's deep, husky voice suddenly said. I had not noticed her before, but there she was, a head taller than anyone else, standing in the circle directly facing the priest. They made a contrast, the fair-skinned, blushing priest and the dark, glowing woman. Fillin's hands tightened even harder on my shoulder. There was no love lost between him and Juniper. She shall have a Christian home, he said dismissively. I will send her to Mass, of course, said Juniper. Fillin ignored her, but I could feel his hesitation. A murmur was running around the circle. Nobody liked Greta very much, and they did not want to entrust the child to her. Perhaps too often they were afraid of making Juniper angry, since they feared her powers. In any case, they felt a pull toward Juniper. She was their magic woman, exactly as Fillin was their priest. They did not care to have to choose between them. Why not let the wise child choose herself, said Juniper. The people murmured again. I had turned scarlet with the embarrassment of this terrible occasion and the agony of having to choose. For the first time in my life, I looked squarely at Juniper. I saw her slender height, the laughter lines in her face. Even at this moment, she had a merry expression, her lips parted over strong white teeth. She had deep dark eyes that had looked on sorrow somewhere. She wore a dark red dress, or women dressed themselves in black or brown, and a great ruby on her finger. Under the big straw hat, her skin was a rich olive, and her hair glossy black like my own. I glanced at Greta, at her small bitter face, closed like a trap, at the long scrawny arms with which she slapped her children. I looked too at the two children standing beside her, with their cunning, suspicious faces. I could not possibly live with Greta, yet Juniper, we all knew, worked for the devil, and if I worked for her, I might be damned forever. I wrung my hands at my terrible predicament. Just then, Aunt Morag, poor, fearful Aunt Morag, who lived in dread of Gregor's temper, and who rarely raised her voice outside her own home, spoke in a loud, clear voice. There's Finbar's opinion to be considered, she said. Finbar? Said Fillin in surprise. Before he went away, we foresaw the possibility of his mother's death, and that Wise Child would need a home until he returned. He said that if that should happen, she was to go to Juniper, that he had asked Juniper to undertake this for him, and that she had agreed. Juniper neither confirmed nor denied this. She just smiled. It took me a few moments to understand it, child as I was. I knew perfectly well that Aunt Morag was lying. It would not occur to Finbar to plan for my future in that way. He would never have anticipated the problem, so Aunt Morag must be lying for a purpose. The purpose, I knew at once, was to give me a sort of cue. The cue that it was all right to live with Juniper, no matter what I had been told about her. I responded instantly and automatically. I want to live with Juniper, I said. The priest blushed more furiously than ever. Is there not a Christian home that will take this child? He asked. The people murmured among themselves again. They knew very well that Juniper could afford to feed me, better than any of them could. It was all very well for Fillin. No hungry children waited in his house. Uncle Gregor, perhaps not wanting to be outdone by Aunt Morag, perhaps feeling that it was time to exert some sort of patriarchal right over his female possessions, intervened at this point. If it was Finbar's wish, he said. Perhaps I do him an injustice. Perhaps he too was genuinely anxious about what would become of me. Fillin knew that he was defeated. The anger showed clearly enough in his face. Very well then, he said. The Kylid shall take her. There was a slight shock of surprise at hearing him use this word. It was a word you used behind people's backs, not to their faces. Good, said Juniper. Wise Child. You only just sit with your grandmother before her funeral. After the funeral, Tilly and I will come to collect you. She gave me her warm, friendly smile, slipped through the crowd, and was gone. The crowd began to disperse too. not in its usual gossipy fashion, but quickly and silently, as if something distasteful had been completed. And then I was walking home with my aunt and cousins. I walked apart, angry at my public ordeal, and above all frightened. What had come to me that I, alone, of everyone I knew, had to live with a witch? Nobody spoke about it. About halfway home, Coleman slipped his hand into mine. I did not acknowledge that he had touched me, but I did not let go. It was the custom to sit up with our dead, and that night my aunt and I dutifully took our seats beside the body of the old woman, who now looked so different that I did not feel she was my granny at all. They had tidied her hair and dressed her in a grey dress that I recognized, but it was the expression on her face that was quite different. After what seemed an age, Coleman slipped into the room and began to sit too. It was indescribably boring just sitting there, and I wept quite a lot. Not for my grandmother, who seemed to be all right, but for myself, who was henceforward a lost soul. My aunt heated some soup on the fire at about midnight, which was a great treat. I realized that I was starving, but soon after that I seemed unable to keep my eyes open any longer. The next thing I remember is seeing bright sunlight shining on the bed, and Coleman and I were both lying on it together. Coleman was still asleep, and so was my aunt. Still propped awkwardly in her chair, I thought, I want my grandmother buried so that life can begin again here again. I want my grandmother buried so that life can begin again. But then I remembered what that life was to be. I wept quietly. Coleman woke up and saw the tears on my cheeks. He was never a child of many words. Finbar may be back any time, he said. I'm frightened, I sobbed. Coleman did not try to comfort me, knowing that in my situation he would be equally frightened himself. Later in the day, my cousins, less kind than he, remembered all the child gossip they had heard about Juniper. Like me, they were fascinated and excited by the idea of magic, but also afraid of it, partly because they thought it was wicked, and also because they were afraid it might hurt them. It was said that witches brought diseases, poisoned crops and animals, and killed people they did not like. She has these two huge cats that are her familiars, and they talk with her just like people. She rides on a broom on moonlight nights, and you can see her outline against the moon. She meets with the other witches, and they all dance without their clothes on, and they... Myrie went off into a gust of giggles and began to whisper something in Seamus's ear so that he began to giggle too. They say that under her house are enormous caves with big piles of jewels, rubies and emeralds, gold and pearls. She gives you honey drinks that make things look all different. I but the evil one, Dommel crossed himself, comes there often, and there are ghosts in her house, unquiet spirits, and she summons up the dead. That there are murdered children there. I stamped my foot. Stop it, I said. Finbar will be home soon, and then I will go and live with him. But I was very scared. My face was washed, my poor uneven hair was combed back and stuck down with grease, which Juniper told me later made my eyes look enormous and my forehead white and bare. I was put into a black gown, too big for me, that I kept tripping over, and I wore my good leather shoes that I was proud of. My Uncle Connor and some other men carried my grandmother's coffin out of the house, and I was glad to see it go, for in the hot weather the body seemed to make a strange, sweetish smell in the house that I hated. And I was bored with all the sitting still and the watching. Watching what? There was nothing to see. I had chosen the things that I was going to take with me. A winter smock and a summer one, my smart stockings my grandmother had knitted in wheel stitch, my hood and cloak, a doll called Nan, a rope for skipping, and a mouse Coleman had once carved for me in wood. My aunt packed them in my basket with an apple and kissed me tenderly. We'll pause there.